Welcome to the Board Game Design Lab podcast. Each week, we want to bring you an insightful interview on a specific topic in board game design to help you design and create games people love. And now, here's your host, Gabe Barrett.
What's up, my friends? Welcome to the Board Game Design Lab. We're here today talking about two-player games, two-player experience, what makes a really good two-player game. And we're talking to the resident expert on the two-player experience, Mr. Richard Ham from Rahdo Runs Through. How you doing, Richard?
Hey, man. I don't know that I would call myself an expert. Maybe more of an advocate.
An advocate? Well, considering the experience you have in playing two-player games, how many games do you think you've played in that two-player mode?
Oh, I mean, all. I pretty much play 100% of my gaming, or 99.9% of my gaming is two-player only. If it doesn't have a solid two-player mode or variant or whatever you want to call it, I'm probably not going to give it a second thought. I'm never going to look at it.
Right, and just give me an idea. How many games do you think you've played since 2009 when you first got in the hobby?
Oh, let's see. I would hazard a guess, since I got in the hobby, probably not quite 1,000.
Right. See, I'm going to call you an expert just from the sheer number of experiences you've had and the differences and seeing it in different angles. I realize you're not a designer, but you are more than qualified to be here today talking to us.
Well, I will agree I am an expert in what I like. So we'll go with that.
We'll go with that, and that's what we're going to talk about today, just getting your thoughts, your perspective, your angle on the two-player experience. You know, there's a lot of game designers out there hopefully listening right now that are creating some really cool games, and I just want them to be aware of that two-player mode because there are so many people that are only able to play two players. I'm one of them. I live in Honduras, and it's just me and my wife that play games together. I know you're over in Malta, and so your wife's your main...
Same situation.
Yep, exactly. And do you have like any kind of a gaming group, any kind of friends over there that you're able to play with?
Oh, do I have any friends?
Well, friends that play games.
Well, let's see. I live on Gozo, which is a little tiny satellite island off of Malta itself. And there are some gamers. There is a gaming group in Malta that meets weekly. But for me to get to them would be about a 2-hour trip there or a 2-hour trip back. Mm-hmm. Plus, a ferry ride that's not cheap. So it just doesn't make any sense. Yeah,
I understand. For me, most of the people here speak Spanish. And so I would have to go through every game and translate everything into Spanish. And I just play with my wife. It's just easier just to play me and her. Or the friends that I do have that are Americans. They love the big party games. Like Spyfall works really well with them in games like that. Sure. But I'm not going to sit down and play Pandemic with them or anything of that weight or heavier. And so that's where I'm at. But I feel like the two-player experience is good. You know what I mean? Like you get a lot in that two-player experience. If a game does it well, that can even be better than the four-player experience in a lot of games. And so I just want to talk about what makes a good two-player experience, what makes a good game scale, like how it scales down and things like that. So from your perspective, what is better in games about the two-player experience that you don't get in the bigger play counts?
Well, I mean, I'm actually inclined to agree with you. Even if I was surrounded by 3 or 4 different game groups and they were all 5 minutes away, I would still probably be more inclined just to play with Jen because I do tend to enjoy two-player more. And there's a few reasons for it. I mean, probably one of the biggest ones is, chaos versus control. The more players are sitting at that table, the more stuff is going to happen to the board before it comes back around to my turn. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In some games, that's a really great thing because some designs embrace that chaos and want to put you in a situation where it's very tactical. Right, it's my turn. What can I do right now? But both my wife, Jen, and I find that we prefer to be able to think a little bit more long-term. We are more strategic players than tactical players. We do like to make a bigger, more high-level plan and see it play out over several turns. With only one other player at the table, the world is just fundamentally not going to change as much before it comes back around to me. So that's a big, big part of it. You have more control. Not always, but as a general rule. I mean, heck, sometimes games will try to emulate the chaos you get from other players by actually, throwing in events or what have you that'll happen just to keep things spiced up. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think we just kind of tend towards liking control over chaos. Another big thing, probably even bigger, is time. when it boils right down to it, every additional person you add, it's going to add, well, depending on the game, an extra 10 minutes, an extra 20 minutes, an extra hour, whatever it might be. I like to get in, get it done, and move on to the next thing wherever possible. So, just because, I want to do more with less. Specifically play more games in less time if I ever can. I mean, I don't mind occasionally sitting down for some big epic 3-hour-long game, but if I had my druthers, I'd rather play 3 moderately epic games in the same amount of time and get 3 radically different experiences. So, that's really a big part of it too. But even more than either of those is the fact that I love my wife. She's my partner for life. She's my best friend. There is no better person to play games in the world than her for me. No offense to the other people who I occasionally play games with. They're all very nice and lovely and charming and affable, but they don't hold a candle to my wife.
Right. Yeah, I understand totally there. One thing I love about the two-player experience is it does allow you to really strategize, to really think through and come up with this big strategy, and it doesn't usually get broken down the way it does in a 3, 4, 5 player game. And so but that can also be kind of a detriment. So what are some of the worst things, or the things that make the two-player experience worse than the bigger play counts?
Well, I would say certainly for us, the biggest problem with two-player is it almost always makes the game more cutthroat because of the zero-sum nature. If you and me are playing with another player, a third party, and I have an opportunity during play to go after you, to destroy something you've done or steal something from you or whatever, that implicitly means that I'm slowing you down, but I'm also slowing myself down. Because I'm not moving myself forward, I'm slowing you down. And that means that third or that fourth or fifth player, they're the ones who come out ahead. So, me making an aggressive move against you, it has to be really, really useful. So I'm not put in a situation quite as often, no matter what game it is, to just rush right out and beat you down. But suddenly, when there is no third party, and every time I stop you, that is moving me forward in equal measure, it becomes a much more viable, much more powerful, and much more attractive alternative to just go right in and bury you. And, for some people, that's not going to be a problem at all. Heck, for some people, that's probably another feather in two players' cap. Yeah, that every time I try to, smash your sandcastle, it's building mine up twice as fast. But for me and Jen, we don't want to attack each other. We don't want to hurt each other. We want to be able to build something. We want something we're proud of and do the best we can, but not at the expense of each other, because I would take no pleasure in actually harming my wife, either in a game or in real life. I mean, I just cannot do it. And I know a lot of people say, oh, it's just a game. You got to put that aside. Bygones be bygones. Doesn't matter. I can derive no pleasure from schadenfreude. Schadenfreude is an alien concept to me. If I do something that harms her, even if she's totally fine, she's like, no, go ahead. I deserve it. I was way too wide open. You got to come in here. You got to smack me down. I still feel terrible about it. And why do I want to play a game that makes me feel terrible? It just makes no sense. So, because I am the ultimate Care Bear. And by the way, that's not just with my wife. A lot of people say, oh, yeah, you just don't want to hurt your wife, but you'll get more bloodthirsty other people. No. If I was playing with you, I wouldn't want to smash your sandcastle either. I would feel bad about it. And so why would I want to play a game that makes me feel bad? Unfortunately, a lot of times, a two-player game will put me in a situation where, okay, I've got an option here. I can do this thing, which is kind of nice. It'll help me out a little bit. Or I can do this thing that will crush you. And it has the amplified element of building me up just through the zero-sum nature. So I have to do that. So that's a real problem. There are so many games that Jen and I would love to play, but because they just have a tiny smidge of player versus player aggression woven in, and if you were to play it as a 3 or 4 or 5 player game, it would just be a little bit. Often you wouldn't even do it. In a 2-player game, suddenly those become huge winning strategies. That means there's a lot of wonderful games. Deus, 7 Wonders Duel. I could list off a dozen games with a little bit of thought that we love the design of, but we just won't touch with a 10-foot pole because in 2-player and 2-player only, they become too mean.
Yeah, I remember your run-through of Eclipse was like that, where you talked about at the end. He's like, well, I love building up this over here, but there gets to a point in the game where I now have to go destroy what my opponent has built, and how the game was just not for you because of that. But, in a 3 or 4 player game, all of a sudden you can spread that, attacking out, so you don't feel like, you're just focused on one player, destroying everything they've built. Now you can kind of go over here, go over there, go over there, and it doesn't feel as cutthroat or as mean.
Exactly, yeah.
It's funny you talk about being the Care Bear. I've got a buddy that you actually played his prototype for a game years ago at I don't even remember the convention, but it was a Take That game. It's a space battle, one-on-one, Take That, fighting game, and I'm not going to say the name because I don't want him to I don't want to embarrass him. But you got to the end of it, and you said, well, it's a pretty good game, but it's not for me. And like, you crushed him in that moment. And I was actually talking to him the other day, and I was talking about this interview coming up, and he said, yeah, he played my game. He said it wasn't for him. Like, he was all sad. And I said, yeah, but that's because your game is a Take That game. Like, Rahdo doesn't like games that he's just going back and forth fighting and destroying his. Like, he didn't understand. Yeah, he didn't know, like, your character of gaming, so to speak. And so, don't worry, I made things right. I made him understand that it had nothing to do with his game so much as just, like, that's not the kind of game you enjoy. But, thinking about designers, it's so important for a designer to realize if you have a game that really self-balances itself with the 3 or 4 players, whatever, it self-balances in that players kind of keep each other in check, or kind of like what you were saying, it makes it not as a good idea to attack another player because that third player all of a sudden has an advantage. Now they can come in, or now they get extra points, whatever. Well, that's not going to be the case in that 2-player experience, and to be aware of that, and I don't know if there's ways to mitigate it so much, but at least think through that process. And that kind of leads to the next question. What are some mechanics that you think work really, really well in 2-player games or the 2-player experience?
Well, I mean, I think just about any mechanism can work perfectly well. I mean, a lot of people say, auctions will never work as a 2-player game. I can show you plenty of auctions that are fantastic 2-player. Worker placement, of course, works very, very well. And worker placement is probably one of the easiest overall game structures to be able to scale down for 2-player, because you just turn off some of the spaces on the board, or there's actually lots of different ways you could do it. But yeah, I mean, I think to flip the question, what would be a game mechanism that cannot be converted into good 2-player? I mean, about the only thing I can think of is trade/negotiation, Settlers of Catan type stuff. Because again, in zero sum, there is no way you and I could ever make a trade, because we both have a vested interest in ensuring that we come out on top. Again, as soon as you've got that third player, let's make a trade that's good for both of us, because it leaves that third player behind. And in 2-player, you can't. But, short of some stuff like that, I mean, anything can work well with 2. Even, the sacred cows that some designers say can never work with 2, like auctions. I mean, Peloponnese is a fantastic 2-player auction game, as is Homesteaders. I mean, Homesteaders is a really cool and interesting example of how to integrate interesting 2-player additional mechanisms to create, in a 2-player situation, the extra dynamics that would go on with a third player, through the use of a dummy bidder, where I forget, it's been a while since I played Homesteaders, but the basics is that there is a third bidder who will follow a certain set of rules, and he becomes a predictable player. And some people might say, I don't want to play against somebody who's predictable. But a predictable element of the game means that just gives me, as a player, another tool that I can manipulate and strategize over. So there's this predictable third player that will always raise their bid from round to round. I didn't win this auction? Okay, next auction, I'm prepared to bid one higher. And I'll bid one higher until I eventually win. And then for the following auction, I'll fall all the way back down, and I'll start working my way back up to where I win. Just having that third person suddenly makes that auction take on this extra level of strategy, and I would suggest takes on an even more interesting level of strategy, because again, he is predictable. It's another thing. A human being, if I know you really well and I have a good idea for what you personally value, then there becomes this interesting metagame. But if you're a total stranger, honestly, I think I'd rather play with a dummy, because I can actually, again, it comes back to that chaos versus control choice. And what's more interesting to you as a player. I like having more strings that I can pull to turn the odds in my favor. Whether I succeed or not is another question, but yeah.
Right, and even having a predictable dummy player, for the most part, people they are fairly predictable in games because there's only a handful of really good options at any given time, and you're not quite sure if they're going to pick option A, B, or C, but you're pretty sure of these three. And so for a dummy player to be predictable, it kind of emulates real life or simulates real life more so than just flip a card and do some random chaotic thing that might make sense or might make no sense at all, because that could really throw off a game when you do that.
Sure.
I want to come back to mechanics that scale well. You kind of touched on that a little bit, but what about a game like Time Stories, where it's very experiential, And so I don't know that this is a mechanic that works or doesn't work with two players, but I know I watched your review or your run through of Time Stories, and you talked about some very interesting issues that I think are important for people designing two-player games to be aware of.
Well, yeah, Time Stories is an interesting situation because for the longest time, when that was first listed on Board Game Geek, they proud and loud said, hey, this is for 3 or 4 players. That's it. And so I had completely ignored the game. I was interested in it, but I said, 3-player minimum? Forget about it. Never going to touch it. And then at the last second, right before they released it, we have 2-player rules. We have 2-player rules. What was their solution for 2-player? Probably the worst example of what a designer can do to scale their game down for 2, which is, each player controls 2 characters. So it's a 4-player game where I'm having to control 2 characters.
Right.
And, God, is there a game where that actually works? Don't get me wrong. That can work, in terms of a raw design exercise. And arguably, it gives you even more strings to pull. Oh, wow, now because I can play these 2 characters off each other in addition to playing them off the 2 that you control. But it changes the flavor. It changes the character of the game too much whenever a game puts you in that circumstance. And certainly that was true for Time Stories. Because what's brilliant about Time Stories really at the end of the day is not that great a game, but it's a phenomenal shared experience you can have. The game is incredibly shallow. Just move from point to point and roll some dice to try to hit certain targets before time runs out. That's it. It's couldn't be more shallow. But the interesting thing about that game experientially is the fact that when I move over to this desk in an office, I'm the only person that moves there. I get to reveal the card. I get to look at that card, see what's hidden inside, what secrets it has waiting to reveal. And this is the brilliant thing about Time Stories. I don't just read the card verbatim to everybody sitting around the table and just become a narrator for the story, which is what every other narrative-driven board game does.
Right.
Every other one. They have a very strict rule. Put the card back down and describe what you saw. And then instantly, I become a storyteller. And that is amazing. That is the true thing that makes Time Stories special above all else. And so that's great. I love that. And I understand why the developers decide, hey, you know what? The more storytellers you have sitting at the table, the more rich and atmospheric the game is going to be. If you have 3 people telling each other stories, great. If you have 4 people, even better. So I understand on some level why they decide, well, you know what? We don't even want 2 people to experience this game because there's just not as much interesting dynamic social elements that come about. And okay, I get that. But then they decide at the last minute, let's have our cake and eat it too. And they just say, let's just make it a 4-player game. Now, Time Stories with the rules as written means we come into a room, okay, I'll move myself to the desk and over to the window. And I will literally, as a character, be in 2 places at once. Mm-hmm. And I'll look at both of these cards, and I'll put them both down, and I'll describe both of them to Jen. So arguably, I'm getting to do twice the storytelling, but I feel like I'm half the character. That character is no longer an avatar for me to project myself to feel like I'm in the world. It's very, very important that when we come into this room and we're deciding, okay, who's going to do what? Okay, I'll go search the decks. You go check the window. If I'm doing both, suddenly I'm not in that world anymore. I am some disembodied general giving orders to other characters. And, that's a textbook example of how to take something that's a really cool, evocative, and engaging experience. Hey, everybody, I'm going to go check out the table. No. Now, okay, I'm going to send him to the table and I'm going to send him to the window. That's not my story I'm telling anymore. And it's heartbreaking to see that they decided to make that choice instead of doing the extra work. And I totally agree. It would be extra work extra tweaking, extra balancing and whatnot to ensure that, you know what, no, the game will work fine with only 2 avatars walking around in the world, so that each player can get that same time story experience of feeling like, no, I'm in this world and I'm telling this story, as opposed to I'm floating somewhere above this world. I'm sitting at a table telling the story of what happened to other people. Yeah. That's probably my single least favorite 2-player solution that a designer can come up with. Just duplicate it. Make it a 4-player game and each player controls 2. It's almost always terrible. Yunnan was another example that did it. And, I mean, that was a brilliant, brilliant game. But, oh, man, I broke my heart when I saw that's how they decided to crack the 2-player nut.
Yeah, I think it's important for a designer who's making an experience-driven game, a game where they want the players to really feel like that character or that person in that world. If you split that, if you make them have to focus on more than just that one character, you're totally going to lose the experience. You're going to feel like a puppet master.
You're going to create a different experience.
Yeah, that's true.
And I got to assume that the Time Stories guys understood that, which is why they kind of rejected doing 2-player in the first place. Right. And I don't know, maybe they just bowed to industry pressure, because if you can't put 2P on that box, you're really going to undercut your sales.
Right, and I feel like that's what it was, and they didn't have time to really create something. Cause,
ironically.
I mean, yeah, they should have gotten back in the caissons. But they didn't have time to come up with a really good 2-player solution, because they have a good 3-player solution. I don't want to do any spoilers, but in the different scenarios, they figured out how to make it good for 3 players so it scales and all that. And they could have done that with 2 players. I feel like they just ran out of time. Ironically, this happens a lot with the other side. A game box will say, "Oh yeah, it's good for 5 or 6 players," and the game is awful with 5 or 6 players, and they put it on there just because it would be a bigger market. It would look better in the marketplace, and okay, we can play with 5, great. But then you play with 5, and it's like a 2-hour long game when it's supposed to be 45 minutes because you got all these extra people and all that. So it's interesting. Have you seen any other games that just don't scale very well with that 2-player experience?
Oh my gosh! So yeah, hundreds of them.
Yeah,
easily.
What are some of the main ones, and maybe give a thought or an idea on why that game just doesn't work well with 2 players?
Okay, hold on a second. Let me pull up a list, because actually I keep a list of every game I've ever gotten rid of, and I just write a little note down for why. Yeah. Because doing Rahdo runs through, people are always asking me, well, why do you still have this game? Why'd you get rid of it or whatnot? Anybody listening can just go and check it out. It's at gone.rahdo.com. And let's see. So I've just gone here, and how long is this list now? What is this list at?
And real quick, so for everybody listening, I want you to understand, I'm not doing this to rag on games or to make fun of any games or anything like that. I think it's important to recognize when a game doesn't work very well. And again, this is all opinion-based. But when a game doesn't work well and why, so that we can learn how to do better, how to grow from the experience. Go back and watch the film on other things, so to speak, and gain from it. So, yeah.
I'm looking at, this is a list of 468 games that I have had and gotten rid of over the last few years. And easily a third of all of these, my note was, needs more than 2 players to reach full potential. It just happens over and over and over again. And it's almost always, let me just pick one. I'm sorry, actually, I've totally lost track of what the question was. I just went down my own little rabbit hole here.
What are some of the games that really just don't work well with 2 players? Maybe they're great games, but just don't work with 2 players.
Just in general, that can't be made to work well with 2-player. Probably. I mean, like I mentioned, any game that relies on players doing any kind of barter or social interaction just kind of falls apart. Because you just can't make deals. And I mean, another really tough one is going to be any kind of area control game, because again, it comes back to that whole, that zero-sum nature that, the game becomes a bit more dry and boring, a bit more tit for tat. Look, here's a certain amount of terrain there is out in the world, and whoever has the most of it by the end of the game wins. When there's 3 players, you suddenly get these incredibly interesting and dynamics going on of, okay, I really own this northern territory, and the 2 of you are kind of like dueling it out for the south. And then at some point during the game, you realize, oh my God, we've been fighting each other so long, we're going to let whoever's up north win. We have to basically temporarily put aside our differences and kind of agree to take him down. That kind of thing can never happen in a two-player game.
Yeah.
Because, again, it comes back to that zero sum. Every time I take something from you, I've effectively gained it for myself. Every point you lose is a point I gain. And so, an area control game is going to be one that really, really has a hard time with that. So, but I mean, there are certainly examples of area control games that work well with two. I mean, heck, there are examples of area control games that are designed to work only with two, like a Twilight Struggle or 1960. So, I mean, those games can't be just a straight, area control. Yeah, you've got your 3 troops in. I've got to move 4 troops in. And that means your 3 are out, my 3 are out. I'll have 1 left over. It can't be as simple as that. Suddenly, area control has to take on different layers of mechanisms. Like, once you've allowed me to take control of a certain area and hold it for a while, it becomes harder and harder and harder and more difficult for it to be taken from me. Once I'm really entrenched. So you almost have to kind of give up on it. You have to make a choice. As soon as you see me take something, do I abandon what I'm trying to do myself to prevent you from holding on to that, or do I let you get your roots in? That's something you don't need in an area control game with more, because the dynamism of constantly shifting alliances creates a really cool ecosystem for the game. But with 2 players, you have to work a lot harder to make that an interesting experience that's worth coming back to over and over again.
Right. Considering that list that you have right there in front of you, what are some of the trends that you see? Like, are there any kind of things that happen over and over and over again? You said just doesn't live up to potential, but anything else?
I will tell you, by far, the single biggest mistake, and I see it over and over and over again, and it's child's play for designers to solve this problem. It's not at all uncommon. It's actually another form of area control to have a progress meter, right? It's a progress meter for fame or power or money or whatever. And at the end of the game, whoever is at the top of this meter, whoever has pushed their way up the farthest, they score 10 points. And whoever comes in second scores 5 points, whoever comes in third scores 2 points, and whoever comes in fourth and fifth scores nothing. Right? It's a really common thing. You see that in hundreds of games. And almost without exception, when they say, for the 2-player rules, they change nothing. And then, whoever comes in first gets 10 points, whoever comes in second gets 5 points. Mm-hmm. So they don't change anything at all. Here's what that does to the game. It completely guts that system, because you work really hard. You climb way up to the top of that thing to score those 10 points at the end of the game. You know what? I completely ignore that meter for the whole game, and then at the last second, I just move up 1 pip on it, and I come in second. That's so broken. Mm-hmm. Or what they'll often do is they say, for the special case rules, there is no first place, there is only second place. So nobody can get 10 points off it, but whoever hits the most on it will get 5, and there is no third place. That's still just as busted. And, I mean, don't get me wrong, it works, it functions, but it loses any zazz that it once had. Super simple solution for that. Any designer, whoever wants to put a progress meter, must go and play a 2-player game of, what was it? Belfort. Is it Belfort? Yeah, Belfort, which is a worker placement game, which has these progress meters. And here's the thing: it's so simple. Just you and me. We're playing a 2-player game. We're both vying for dominance of this particular progress meter. When it gets to the end of the game, when you get to final scoring, take a piece from a 3rd player, put them at space number 7. That's it. Or right at the very beginning of the game, just put them at 7 on that scale of 1 to 10, and never move them. Now, just by putting that 1 piece on the board, the fight for first or second becomes much more challenging. If you actually want to get first place, you got to move all the way up to 8. That's a lot of work. It means you got to commit a lot of time. And now I can't just come in and get second place for nothing. I've got to work to be able to get second place. Otherwise, I can get third. A simple little thing like that, just putting 1 piece of wood, 1 token on the board as part of setup, and instantly that battle in 2-player is just as interesting. It's not as dynamic, but it's just as fulfilling as it would have been with more players. And yet the number of times I see designers not do that, it is mind-boggling to me.
Right. It's so much easier not to. And I guess in your head you think, this works, So let's just focus on other parts of the game. But like what you're saying with Belfort, just by taking the time and the effort to come up with one solution can keep the feeling of the game that you're really chasing after. Because just because a game works doesn't mean it's accomplishing what you want to accomplish. Just because it functions in that two-player mode. And that's one thing I've talked to people about is focus on the player experience more so than does a mechanic work, does a theme work, all those things. Are the players experiencing what you want them to experience? Do you want them to experience frustration? Okay, that's fine if that's what you want. But if it's not what you want, then be very, very aware of the mechanics in your game, specifically when you're scaling to different player counts. Now, are there any other?
It's definitely. I think it's one of the reasons Stefan Feld is one of the most consistently reliable two-player designers out there, or which is all his games support 4 or 5 players, but they almost always work well with 2. Is because I've read this several times. He plays his games tons with his wife. His wife is his number one tester. Yep. And I think a lot of times it's painstaking. It takes a lot of time for a designer to actually properly play test their game. And, they feel like, I'm going to get a lot more testing out of this if I test this as a 4-player game every time, because I'm getting 4 people's worth of input instead of just 1 if I test it as a 2-player game. And so the 2-player invariably falls behind. And as you yourself said, well, okay, yeah, we'll just make a couple of changes. Yeah, that works. Now let's get back to play testing it with 4 or 5 players so we can, in the same amount of time, get a ton more feedback. And then the 2-player suffers.
Right. Yeah, and honestly, it's just lazy. It's just being lazy as a designer. A lot of times, I'm sure there's other circumstances and other things that play into it, but it's wanting to get the game out before it's ready. It's not taking the time to really focus on that last 5% of that game to make it great, and just being satisfied with it being okay or good. Are there any other trends that you see in that list of the games you've gotten rid of?
Let's see. Well, another one, I mentioned up front that, worker placement, generally speaking, is a really good candidate for, 2-player scaling, because all you got to do is just, cut off some of the pieces on the board, right? Easy peasy. But for some games, their design is such that, we can't get rid of any of these spaces. We fundamentally can't, because we only have 6 worker placement spaces. Each one of them is for a different action. We can't just arbitrarily say, hey, let's just remove 2 of these spaces. And so, I guess we won't scale that. And then suddenly, the 2-player worker placement of this game becomes much more loose. And, there's not that same level of tension of, oh my gosh, can I get where I need to go, as fast as I want to? And, that's such an easy thing to solve. Stefan Feld, again, great 2-player designer. Go back. Any designer who is doing a worker placement and you run into this situation where you can't just arbitrarily say, I just got rid of 30% of my worker placement spots because you need them all. Look at what Stefan Feld did with Year of the Dragon. Year of the Dragon, the main thing you're doing every round is there's a set of actions and players are drafting for it. Whoever goes first gets that action, and everybody wanted that action. So it's kind of the equivalent. It's almost a worker placement, but it's just instead of placing workers on a tile, you grab the tile for yourself, right? And so in a 2-player game, if everybody could just grab a tile, you grab the tile I want, there's still plenty of other tiles. I'll grab another tile, no big deal. So here's what he did. He says, as part of the setup in a given round, take those tiles. I think there's 5 of them. Take those 5 tiles, shuffle them up, and make a group of 3 tiles and a group of 2 tiles. Now, whoever is first player, he gets to grab either of those groups. And by him taking that, not only did he take the one he wanted, he took, if he takes the group of 3, he took 2 other tiles. And now I'm stuck with just these other 2. And I desperately need the one that's in the group he took. Now, that doesn't really fundamentally change anything about the core of the game, but suddenly, he didn't get rid of any of the 5 actions he needed to do, but with this one extra rule that happens with smaller player counts, the game gets just as tight and just as tense, and fighting for first player is just as important as it is with the higher, because it's not loose anymore. And that is a solution that you could easily apply. Like, actually, what was an example of it? Islebound is again, it's not a worker placement game. It has the same basic thing. It's a pick up and deliver game. You're sailing your Corsair or your ship from island to island. And the thing is, if a person is in a space that I want to go to, I can go there, much like a worker placement, but I have to pay a little bit extra. right? So there's a cost to getting in. But the problem is, in a 2-player game, the board is so wide open. You know what? That's just never going to happen. I'm not going to pay to go to where you are. I'm just going to go someplace else, and I'll wait for you to move away. And in my run through, I complained about that the board just isn't as tight as I know it would be if I was playing with a higher player count. And I mentioned, again, borrowing from Stefan Feld, if it were as simple as saying, hey, you know what? If you move your ship into a given space, not only that space, but every space around it on the board is considered owned by you. Suddenly, a single player is taking up 20% of the board. And now it's much more likely that that's made things much more difficult for me. And now I've got those same kind of decisions I would have to make. Oh, do I give you the money to go where I need to go, or do I move off someplace else? That's a simple thing you can do, and I was so happy to see they did that. And I haven't actually played Islebound because I never actually got a final that often happens. I often don't end up getting retail copies of the prototypes I do. But I read that they did ultimately introduce that, and I've read reviews of it as a 2-player game that say, wow, it's really, really great. It tightens up the board, and it's a simple, natural addition to add. And and that's taking a concept that was from this action tile selection game and applying it to a pick up and deliver game. But you could also apply that to a worker placement game. Because it's that fundamental underlying thing of how do, in a 2-player game, we replicate the end result of a 3 or 4-player game without having to bog the player down with a bunch of extra minutia and upkeep. Simple little things like that, if they just take the time to do it, can exponentially increase the experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Any kind of mechanic you can have in your game or add in your game that either gives the first person to go a place a bonus, or they get a bigger discount, or whatever it is, you just want to make it important. Because in a 4-player, 5-player game, it's important to go to certain places first or to do certain things so that maybe other players can't or whatever. And so you want to create that same kind of experience in that 2-player game because you want to have that tension. I know you've talked about a lot of games that you just felt so abundant in your resources, and like the game was just so we're both so wealthy and rich in resources that it's not as much fun because it's you got all these options and all these different choices to make.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that, and maybe the designer's going for that. Maybe they want to say right up front, you know what, we want the 2-player experience to be more casual and laid back. And that's fine. If that's what you were going for, fine, go for it. But I don't play games just to relax. I play games to be given a series of challenging problems to solve, and so that I can feel good and get that dopamine rush when I do actually solve that problem. That's the fundamental chemistry that makes these things addictive. Let's see, another example. I guess this is an example of something that's done, but it drives me nuts that it's not done. Was it Rob Davio's new legacy game?
Seafall.
Which one? Seafall. Yeah. It doesn't support 2 players. Right. And fair enough. Okay, I'm never going to get a chance to play that game. But my understanding of one of the core elements that the game demands more than 3 players is that it's a runaway leader catch-up problem. If one player, through random luck or happenstance, happens to just take off like a bat out of hell, they just get lucky and things fall in their laps, the other players recognize that and say, okay, we got to put our differences aside and take him down, because the game gives you a lot of tools to be able to sink other players' ships or steal from their home port or whatever. And in a 2-player game, that will never, ever work, because if you get crazy lucky and stream ahead, there's nobody for me to collude with to pull you back down, right? So it fundamentally can't work as a 2-player game. Fine, fair enough. I've made my peace with the fact I'll never get to play Seafall. I wonder, though, could they have not introduced a mechanism that, a simple set of rules that recognizes for 2-player that if one player pulls out ahead like that there is an external third force that will pull them back down. That will slow them down, so it gives the other player the opportunity to rubber band up. I mean, rubber banding is a very, very common conceit you see in video games like Mario Kart. In Mario Kart, if you're not doing very well and the AIs just take off and you lost, the AIs, they have a rubber band. They cannot get too far ahead. They give you a chance to catch back up. A well-designed game wants to make sure that happens as well, because it's not fun for anybody. It's not fun for the person who takes off and can't be touched. It's not fun for everybody else who gets left in their dust. So they do catch-up mechanisms where the cost for succeeding becomes higher the further ahead you get of everybody. There's two ways you can resolve that problem. You can come up with a way to do that, or you can come up with a way to let players self-police. Oh, you've pulled out ahead. You're a runaway leader. We'll collude to pull you back down. Two players, you can't do that. Come up with a rubber band. I understand, Rob decided, you know what? We would rather not do that extra work. I'm not going to say it's lazy on his part. That's a big, complex, heavy game to design. Yeah. It just breaks my heart that they couldn't have spent an extra 6 months. But maybe in a game like that they can't, because there's so many permutations. There's so many impacts for every decision that gets made, because every decision you make in a legacy game is permanent. Right. But it still breaks my heart. I bet you there was a way to do it, but the drive wasn't there, because two-player. I mean, it's weird. You go back to 10 years ago, the board game industry. I recently did my top 10 games that I loved that were published before the year 2009. I just put this video up just a couple days ago because I got started in 2009, and most of the games I love came out around that time or immediately after. But there are games that I loved before then. In doing my research and going back and looking at older games that I have loved, the thing I noticed over and over and over again is, my God, nobody cared about two-player back in the late 90s or the aughts or the Audis. They just didn't care. So many games have three-player minimums. And if they do have two-player minimums, your Power Grids, your El Grandes, they might as well not be there, because they're just clearly was not the focus of the game. And it's funny. I mean, I kind of count myself lucky that I got into board gaming in 2009, 2010, because it seems like there was a sea change going on at that point where the two-player experience was deemed to be an equal focus. It's weird. When I started doing Rahdo Runs Through, and my sole focus of the show was on two-player, I heard from so many people in the early days, oh my gosh, thank you for starting to do the show, because we only play two-player and nobody else talks about it. Nobody else focuses on it. Nobody else mentions, how does this play as a two-player game? Nowadays, just in the last 6 years, I think it's really coming on. You're getting a lot more, like you, like me, just couple gaming. Either because of their circumstance of geography, or just the circumstance of their relationship. They don't have other people to play with. So I think it's a golden age for two players. Yay! And there's just a handful of really simple tricks you can apply to most games that make it work.
Yeah, and I want to get back into those tricks here in a second. With a game like Seafall, when you're designing a game that's going to last 15 games or more, I can't imagine the time it would take to come up with that two-player mechanic. I know it is. I know it's there. I know it's possible for that game to do it, but it would have been so difficult. One interesting thing I was thinking about, the catch-up mechanics I've seen. So like a lot of games have that mechanic where whoever's in first place has to give a resource or give money or give something to the person in last place. Whoever's in first loses something. Whoever's in last gains something, and it hopefully will balance some things out. Well, if that mechanic is also in the two-player game, it can make some really interesting scenarios. I was playing a game, this is sometime last year, with a friend of mine, and he was in first place by like 2 points. Just barely after this round. And then he had to give me this like really great resource that was going to really help him. Well, now he had to give that to me because I was technically in last place. Yeah. And he looked at me, he goes, this can't be the rule. Like there's no way. This is not, like, we searched that rule book, but it was in the two-player game, just like the regular game. And so
that's an example of a design mechanism it's got its heart in the right place. Yeah. But it is almost always a mistake to be so blatant and open with your catch-up mechanisms. You really got to find a good way to hide them. Yeah. Like what's a good example? The city building game, Sunset City, Sunrise City, something like that.
Is that the one where you stack the cards, the tiles?
Yeah. You have really thick tiles. Mm-hmm. As you work your way around the scoreboard, the victory point track, mm-hmm. It's broken up into sections so that, I'm getting 1 for 1, because I think, if I recall correctly, you turn money into points in that game or something like that. And I'm getting 1 for 1, 1 point for $1. But then you hit a wall where, I can't jump into the next section of this until I pay a certain amount of money, or maybe it's when you jump into the next section, if it gets more expensive. The notion of, the more successful you are, the tougher things get for you, because you've got more stuff going on. Martin Wallace's A Few Acres of Snow. is brilliant. It's a deck builder that's crossed with a war area control game. Every time I take a new plot of land on the map, that is represented by me having to add a bunch of command cards related to that plot of land into my deck. And those command cards only have very, very limited use. They kind of clog up my deck, because, I'm out on the front. I'm trying to take over this spot, but I get a bunch of cards that have to do with this piece of land I got way back early in the game. They're just wasting. So the fact that I'm being more successful in pulling ahead is creating additional problems for me to solve because I'm a captain of industry. I'm a captain of this huge, big nation, and it's tougher to keep all my ducks in a row. Whereas the player who's in last place, the player who's fallen behind, I've got a tighter, slimmer deck that is designed for victory. That is, that's just as blatant and transparent a catch-up mechanism as what you just described, but it's not, because it feels natural. Mm-hmm. It feels like an organic progression of what would just happen in this simulation, as opposed to, because in the real world, winners aren't forced to give money to losers.
Right.
Now, but they can be. You can find ways. I mean, in the real world. Well, I don't want to go down too far into politics,
so we get
but in the
taxes
real world,
and whatnot. Yeah.
It's not all that uncommon that higher earners are in a higher tax bracket and therefore pay more in taxes, unless you happen to. Well, anyway, yeah. But you know what I'm talking about.
Right.
So, I mean, that's a way that you can integrate a catch-up mechanism into a game that feels more appropriate and won't pull you out of the game and make your friends say, "Come on, this is
garbage." Yeah. Because I beat him. He had to do that. It was a 3-round game, and he had to give me resources or something like that for 2 of those rounds going into the third. And so I won in the third round because of the things he had to give me, not because he didn't play well, not because I made better decisions really, but because the game beat him down and put us too close to even at the end when he should have been far ahead. He was outplaying me by leaps and bounds. But I won because the game.
One would argue. I would imagine the designer of that game would argue that he didn't outplay you leaps and bounds because, I'm playing devil's advocate here. That was a predictable element of the simulation. And if he was playing all his angles, he would have been playing that angle too.
Yeah, fair enough.
He would have waited. I mean, a system like that could actually add more depth and interest to the game by making it a viable choice to stay behind.
True.
I want to stay behind. You were outplaying him by staying just behind him just enough so that it would flip. And he could realize, well, this isn't doing any good. I got to let you surge ahead of me.
Right.
So that I could get pulled back up. So one could argue, now I don't know what the game is, but, again, a good designer could make anything a viable and interesting part of the simulation.
Very true. That's a good point. And it gets back to what kind of experience do you want the players to have? And do you want a different experience for 4 players than 2 players, or are you trying to simulate the exact same kind of experience for all player counts? Let's get back into what are some of the best mechanics you've seen in scaling. The games that have done it well, they've just scaled down. You talk about Belfort. You talk about some other games that have done really, really good jobs of the scaling down. What are some of those little details that make a game good for 2 players?
You want more? I gave you Belfort, Year of the Dragon, man. That's it. All right. Let me. Here's the one thing. Arguably, I have an encyclopedic knowledge of games, but I don't know how to read the Dewey Decimal System, so I can never actually find anything in my library of game knowledge. Let me pull up a list of games I like and see if anything jumps out at me as being a good example. As I watch, there we go, Chrome. You did it. Let's see. Oh, right off the bat, Dungeon Pets has, I think, one of the most beautiful, brilliant, board-tightening mechanisms for worker placement I've ever seen, and I've never seen anybody duplicate it or adopt it. And every time I think it should be in every worker placement game that wants to be a 2-player. It's basically the notion. It's another way. I talked about that earlier, that a problem with worker placement, tightening up the board, could be, we can't tighten up the board. We need all these spaces. We can't get rid of these actions. So, in the Year of the Dragon, that was one way to do it. Come up with a thing where, hey, you know what? I'm not just claiming one action. I'm claiming this action and all adjacent actions. So that, tightens the board up. That's a really simple thing to do. But what Dungeon Pets did is, if you're playing the 2-player game, you put the workers for a third dummy player on certain spots on the board. Right, and I forget where they are. They start out on the food space and the trap space or something like that. These are places you'd want to go to grab some food or some traps. And, okay, for the first round of the game, those spaces are occupied. It's as if player 3, he got to go first and he just snagged both of those spaces. At the end of round 1, each of those 2 little dummies, they move clockwise to the next space on the board. In fact, there's actually little arrows on the board that show where they will move from round to round. So we know in the first round, we can't pick up traps and vegetables, right? And I know for a fact in the second round, I am not going to be able to pick up, I forget what they are, cages and potions, because I know that's how they're going to move. So that creates a deeper and more interesting circumstance. I don't feel like I need potions right now, but I know I can't get them next turn. Not because somebody might beat me to them, but because they will just literally disappear. So that gives me an extra thing to think about. Maybe I should grab a potion right now. I might not have otherwise, but if I'm bearing in mind there is this extra element to the simulation that in 2 turns, okay, potions will be they're available now, they're available in 2 turns. They're not available next turn. Should I grab one now and wait on this other thing? But in 2 turns, I know the auction block is going to be gone. And in 2 turns from now, that's when I'm planning to sell my pet. And I want to be on the auction block so I can get the best price. So, I'm now, because of this super duper simple thing that couldn't be more simple and elegant and intuitive. You just put these things on the board as part of setup every round. You just move them to the next spot. Suddenly, the game has become much deeper and richer. I am now in a situation where I can be plotting 2, 3, 4 rounds in advance. And I'll be honest, I'm not that smart a player. I'm not some big chess grandmaster who can pull that kind of stuff off normally. But the predictability of the simulation with this simple little rule that you could apply to any worker placement game under the sun. This would instantly plug in anywhere, and it would replicate the dynamism of a 3 or 4 player game because, hey, there's another player on the board. But in the same way that if I know you really well and I know how you love to play the game, I can predict what you're going to do. I could predict what this dummy's going to do because there are rules that say what he's going to do. Simple system, so brilliant. That's why Vlaada Chvátil's the best. He tightened up that board brilliantly in Dungeon Pets. What else? Most of the time, your castles of Burgundy. Yeah, you just do the obvious thing. You instead of 4 green tiles that come out every round, only 2 come out. So simple, easy, no problem. And nations, same thing. Only 3 cards come out into every row instead of 5 cards. So, there's just fewer resources. Now, some people will complain, though. Actually, it's interesting. People complain about the design of nations, that if you're playing it with lower player counts, it becomes too random, which is an interesting and almost unexpected thing because we were talking about how normally 2-player gives you more control. There's less randomness. There's less chaos because you can anticipate better how the game is going to evolve. And less stuff happens before it comes back around to your turn. But people argue that Nations becomes more chaotic because if you're playing the full player count of Nations, every single card is going to come out. Because every round, you fill up every column. But if you play 2-player, you only fill up 3 of the 5 columns. So what is that? 2/5 of all the cards will never appear in the game.
Right.
And that means if you're a super Mensa level player who thinks, right, I know at some point Alexander Graham Bell is going to come out, and my entire strategy is built on when he's going to come out. I'm playing 2 hours into the future for when that card is going to come, but I can't be sure if it's going to come. The game is weaker because there's that unpredictability. I say, oh my gosh, that's so wonderful. I'm so happy to play Nations and not be guaranteed that Alexander Graham Bell is going to be in the game every single time. Because it's interesting. Already, as a 2-player game, I'm playing more strategically because I have more control. I don't mind that the flip side of that is a little bit more chaos gets introduced back in to replicate the chaos that I would get with a higher player count. So to me, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It all comes out in the wash. But I know for some people, that makes nations a poor two-player game, and that's why they'd rather play Through the Ages, because no matter what your player count is in Through the Ages, every single card will come out. Me, I like a little bit more unpredictability. So Nations is an interesting case study. You know, they did the simple thing. Just turn off a couple of columns of cards. Less cards will come out. 2/5. I forget if those are the actual numbers, but you get the idea. But for me, that makes the game stronger. What else?
The only thing I would wonder about, though, in a design like that is if you have a bunch of cards that are balancing cards. So if you have a red card that balances out a blue card, but now because you've limited the number of cards that come out, that blue card never comes out, which creates a power vacuum, so to speak, where the red is now ultra powerful. That's the only thing to be aware of in that kind of situation is the balancing.
But you said the magic words. Be aware of.
True.
That's only a problem if you have a situation where noobs are playing against advanced players, and the advanced players are kind of dicks and don't clue their friends into the fact that, oh, by the way, I'm really good at this game. I just want to give you a couple little hints so you won't get completely destroyed by me. Because we're playing a two-player game, there may or may not be a surplus of blue cards, and that makes them less valuable. Right. So you might not want to try and monopolize those. You just have to bear that in mind. I'm going to bear that in mind. You do it too. And, I mean, it just becomes your example, which is totally valid. That's the nation's issue that people have. That just means it's a risk you have to take. Grab that card knowing that its complementary card may never show up. Maybe you shouldn't grab that card. It adds an element of unpredictability. But you know what? I don't know. I like occasionally rolling dice in a game. Mm-hmm. I like a little bit of unpredictability. Now, there can be too much. There are certainly plenty of games out there that make you roll the die way too much, and predictability goes out the window. But a bit, I liken rolling dice to salt. A little bit of salt just kind of sharpens the meal and just makes it so much better. Too much salt destroys it. I think the same is true of randomness and unpredictability. So I don't mind a little bit of unpredictability, but I know there are some people, diehard, grognards, who want, perfect information. And that's fine. It's just, different strokes for different folks in terms of, the way games work.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get one more mechanic that you think works really well. And then let's go into some advice you would give for designers creating two-player games or trying to scale their games down.
One more.
Pick a good one.
Okay, well, this has kind of been broached, but but just kind of in a roundabout way. But I'm just going to talk about dummy players in general, because it's interesting. Dummy players are kind of a dirty word to a lot of players out there. Oh, it's got a dummy player. Is that their solution? I refuse. Yeah. I refuse to play, sir. I never get that. And I don't think that's the designer's fault. I think that's the player's fault for not recognizing that a good dummy player, there can be such thing as a bad dummy player, a dummy player where the designer tries too hard to replicate everything that a regular player would do, and it just becomes onerous and burdensome, and you're just like, I want to make this dummy go away because it's just slowing down the flow of the game. But a good dummy player, like that example on Belfort I mentioned, where, the only thing the dummy player has to do is just occupy a space on the board, or, the dummy player in Dungeon Pets. That enhances the game because, again, it comes back to what we were talking about right up front. It gives me, in a two-player game, more to think about. I think, and this is blasphemy for a lot of people, Seven Wonders, the modern Antoine Bauza card drafting classic that everybody loves, best player count for that game, as far as I'm concerned, 2. Really? It is at its absolute best as a two-player game because they introduce what I think is called the free city. It's a dummy player. Now, all that dummy player does is just sits over to the side and becomes another resource that you and me playing the game can exploit and manipulate. Now, if that were a real human being, if that were Bob, I can exploit and manipulate Bob, but in a less predictable fashion, because I don't know exactly what he's going to do. I don't know what he's going to hold off and stuff like that. But the free city, I know exactly what they're going to do. I know exactly when they are going to pay money to buy my lumber if they don't have their own, because I'm the one who whispered in there, hey, you want to build that wonder that needs a lot of lumber? Because I'm the only shop in town for lumber, baby. Adding that just makes the game deeper and richer and more exciting. Anybody who says, no, that makes the game awful for whatever reason. I don't understand why. It's so much more fun. There's so much more depth and complexity while still being very intuitive and elegant and simple to understand. It's absolutely lovely. It's weird. Seven Wonders officially isn't a two-player game. They're almost kind of ashamed to admit, oh, by the way, we've got this little two-player variant. We'd really rather you ignore it. But it's like, it's the best version of the game because it's so much. It's all about me interacting with you, but I have an extra tool at my disposal. And the most interesting thing about it is it's a tool that you and I share. We have joint custody of this free city. And that's just a whole nother wheel that has to spin in my head as we're playing the game. It's why Seven Wonders isn't best at two. It's absolutely mind-boggling to me. So my advice would be, I don't know. I want to say my advice is designers, don't listen to those crusty old dinosaurs who hate dummy players. Dummy players done well rock the house. And you just got to wait for those guys to get old and die, because a new generation is coming up of couples gamers who want deeper, richer experiences, who aren't afraid of having a more complex simulation by having a dummy player. I don't know. You gave me the platform, so I'm just going to sing the praises of dummy players.
Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate it. Hey, that's our time today. Rahdo, I really appreciate your insight, your perspective, your thoughts on the two-player experience. We're actually going to go into a bonus round. We're going to talk about some themes that Rahdo loves and some themes that he would really like to see more of in games. You can check that out over on the website, boardgamedesignlab.com. Click on the bonus tab, and you can get all the bonus material from all our episodes. But, Rahdo, really appreciate you being here, man.
Sure thing.
And we'll catch you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. Find all sorts of game design resources, bonus material, and chances to win free games at BoardGameDesignLab.com. And until next time, keep designing, keep playtesting, and keep creating great games. Did I mention keep playtesting?